Today, we have the opportunity to see a dialogue between two North American authors and researchers who have been outstanding contributors to the field of psychology and psychoanalysis, Maurice Eagle and Jerome Wakefield. The occasion for this dialogue is the book that Maurice Eagle just wrote, entitled Subjective Experience, Its Fate in Psychology, Psychoanalysis, and Philosophy of Mind, that will be published by Routledge, London, next year, 2024. First, Maurice Eagle will present this book and mention the reasons that brought him to investigate the fate of subjective experience, considering that it is of fundamental importance for the human being, but it has traditionally been neglected by the disciplines that deal with the study of the mind, such as psychology, psychoanalysis, neuroscience, and philosophy of mind. Then Jerry Wakefield will ask some questions and discuss with Maurice Eagle in order to highlight major aspects of the book. But I want first to introduce briefly our guests, because maybe they are not well known to the participant to this webinar. Maurice Eagle received his doctorate in clinical psychology at New York University in 1958 and was part of the staff of the NYU, New York University, Research Center for Mental Health, at the time directed by Robert Holt and George Klein, where he also had the opportunity to follow the famous seminars of David Rappaport on Freudian metapsychology. After Rappaport's death, his students in 1963 started a study group that in 1971, after George Klein's death, was named Rappaport-Klein Study Group. And I want to mention here that for 12 years, from 1990 to 2001, this group was chaired by Maurice Eagle. In 1972, Eagle moved to Toronto, Canada, where he was professor and chair of the Department of Psychology of York University. In 1995, he went back to New York, where he was professor at Adelphi University, and in 2006, he moved to Los Angeles. Among other things, Eagle was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and President of the Division of Psychoanalysis of the American Psychological Association. But it really would be impossible to mention here his contributions and the many awards and prizes he receives. There are too many. If we mention some aspects of his professional life, we would forcefully not mention other, maybe more important achievements. I would say that one of his merits is that he was never particularly interested in formulating a specific or new psychoanalytic school. Rather, he was always an interpreter and careful critic of the various theories. His interest has always been in raising questions and insisting that psychoanalysis should not be disconnected from the other disciplines, scientific disciplines, and account for his claims on the basis of empirical evidence. He was also particularly interested in the philosophical, methodological, and epistemological problems raised by psychoanalysis. He edited several books. Among many, we could mention the volume he edited with James Barron and David Volitsky, Interface of Psychoanalysis and Psychology, published by the American Psychological Association in 1922. I want here to list only the book he wrote as author, some of them translated into Italian. In 1984, he wrote a book titled Recent Development in Psychoanalysis and Critical Evaluation, that in Italian was entitled La Psicoanalisi Contemporanea. In 2011, From Classical to Contemporary Psychoanalysis, a Critique and Integration. This one too was translated into Italian. Da Freud alla Psicoanalisi Contemporanea, Critica e Integrazione. And the chapter of this book was also published in the journal Psicoterapia e Scienze Umane in 2011. In 2013, Attachment and Psychoanalysis, Theory, Research, and Clinical Implications, that was translated in Italian, this one too, Attaccamento e Psicoanalisi, Teoria, Ricerca e Implicazioni Cliniche. 2018, he wrote two books, a set of two books, Core Concept in Classical Psychoanalysis and Core Concept in Contemporary Psychoanalysis. Both of them had the subtitle Clinical Research Evidence and Conceptual Critique. A chapter of the second volume was pre-published in the Psychotherapia Scienze Umane. The title was Countertransference Revisited, il controtransfer rivisitato. In 2021, he wrote an important book towards a unified psychoanalytic theory, foundation in a revised and expanded ego psychology. This will come out very shortly, in a few weeks, in Italian, with the title Verso una teoria psicoanalitica unificata fondata su una psicologia dell'io riveduta e ampliata. Then we have the book that we discuss today, Subjective Experience, Its Fate in Psychology, Psychoanalysis and Philosophy of Mind. L'esperienza soggettiva e il suo destino in psicologia, psicoanalisi e filosofia della mente. It will come out next year, 2024, in London with the publisher Routledge. I want to say that the introduction of this book that we discussed today is pre-published in issue number 4 of this year, 2023, of the journal Psychotherapia Scienze Umane, the journal I edit, and it will come out in December. Eagle is on editorial board of this journal. We published many papers starting from 1990, more than 30 years ago. Now we'll say a few words on Jerry Wakefield, who holds doctoral degrees in philosophy and in clinical social work, as well as a master's degree in mathematics with a specialty in logics and methodology of science, all from Berkeley. He's a distinguished university professor at NYU, New York University, with appointments in bioethics, social work, psychiatry, philosophy, and at the Institute of Psychoanalytic Education. Previous faculty appointments were at the University of Chicago, Columbia University, and Rutgers University. He's the author of over 300 publications in the philosophy of psychiatry, psychoanalytic theory, and psychiatric epidemiology, and the author, co-author, and editor of 6 books. One of these books is entitled The Loss of Sadness, How Psychiatry Transformed the Normal Sorrow into Depressive Disorders, which was translated into Italian in 2015 with the title La perdita della tristezza, come la psichiatria ha trasformato la tristezza in depressione. That was named the best psychology book of 2007 by the Association of Professional and Scholarly Publishers. His 2 most recent books, Attachment, Sexuality, Power, Oedipal Theory as Regulator of Family Affection in Freud's Case of Little Hans, and the second book is Freud's Argument for the Oedipus Complex, a philosopher of science analysis of the case of Little Hans. These 2 books critically analyze the roots of Freud's Oedipal theory and argue for a clean separation of psychoanalysis from Freud's scientifically unsupported and oppressive sexual theory of the neurosis. Also, Wakefield is in the editorial board of Psychotherapia Scienze Umane, where he published several articles, for example, on the interface between psychology, Freud and cognitive psychology, on the concept of mental disorder, on the pathologization of normality, in other words, on psychiatrists' failure to identify false positive diagnosis. The Italian title was Patologizzare la normalità, l'incapacità della psichiatria di individuare i falsi positivi nelle diagnosi dei disturbi mentali. Also, on a critique on the concept of Oedipus complex. This paper just appeared in issue number 2 of 2023, etc. Regarding the concept of mental disorder and diagnosis, in the early of 1990s, he began to publish in prestigious journals, including the Journal of Normal Psychology and Psychological Review, a series of articles in which he strongly criticized the definition of mental disorder proposed by Bob Spitzer in the DSM-3, highlighting its internal contradictions. Spitzer, who had been the chief of the DSM-3 task force and was considered by many as the most influential psychiatrist of the 20th century, could not help but recognize that Wakefield was right. Not only that, he then decided to collaborate with him. They became friends and wrote articles together. Spitzer also agreed to write the preface to Wakefield's 2007 book on the loss of sadness I mentioned before, in which he criticized the diagnosis, the dangerous expansion of the diagnostic criteria of depression. The Italian edition has the foreword by Mario Mai, the president of the World Psychiatric Association, who always admired Wakefield and often invites him to contribute to the journal World Psychiatry, the official journal of the World Psychiatric Association. For example, he wrote the editorial of the last issue of World Psychiatry, number 2, 2023. Another important area of interest of Wakefield is the philosophy of mind, and to this regard, he published the fourth of a multi-volume series entitled Freud and the Philosophy of Mind by Palgrave Macmillan, 2018. Wakefield has also published extensive empirical studies on the psychiatric epidemiology of depressive disorder. Okay, now Maurice Siegel will present some central issues of his book on subjective experience, and then Jerry Wakefield will ask him some questions. Okay, Maurice.
Thank you, Paolo. What I will try to do is to limit my presentation to about 20 minutes or so and just focus on selective issues in the book. Obviously, I will not be able to summarize the entire book. So let me begin. Although we take it for granted and don't normally give it much thought, except when it's compromised, what's most valuable and precious about being alive is consciousness. That is, being able to think, feel, and experience the world and oneself and others in it. Indeed, at the core of the dread of death is the fear of ceasing to be, that is, ceasing to experience. As Montaigne tells us, quote, death is a limit of experience. And as the philosopher Paul Edwards writes, a person thinking of his own death is thinking of the destruction or integration of his body, but also of the cessation of his experiences. Consider the following thought experiment proposed by Christopher Koch. Let's say you're offered a devil's bargain in which you gain unlimited wealth, but must relinquish all subjective feeling. You can act and speak like a zombie, but no more hearing, smelling, loving, hating, wanting, hoping, and so on. As Koch notes, from your point of view, you might as well be dead. And yet, consciousness and subjective experience have had an uncertain career in the disciplines, psychology, psychoanalysis, and philosophy of mind, the disciplines that are concerned with understanding the nature of mind. To a significant extent, consciousness and subjective experience have been excluded as legitimate subject matter in these disciplines. And let me describe just briefly how the nature of that in the three different disciplines. In psychology, the dominance of behaviorism over a long period of time reflects this exclusionary stance, but it's also present in contemporary cognitive psychology. In his brief history of the emergence of the so-called cognitive revolution, George Miller writes that the cognitive revolution, quote, brought the mind back into experimental psychology, end of quote. However, the aspects of the mind that he brought back into experimental psychology are in his words, its representational and computational capacities, which, as we know, are inherently inaccessible to consciousness. This strategy, this dominant strategy in cognitive psychology, triggers the kind of question posed by Roger Penrose, who asks, might we be doing something with our brain that cannot be described as in computational terms at all? How do our feelings of conscious awareness, of happiness, pain, love, aesthetic sensibility, will, understanding, and so on, fit into such a computational picture. And as further examples of cognitive psychology's attitude towards subjective experience and consciousness, a dominant point of view in contemporary cognitive psychology, which is extended for quite a period of time, that the dominant view is we do not have conscious access to the reasons and motives for our behaviors and decisions. And that when we think we're providing reasons and motives, we are in fact primarily producing socially plausible accounts. This position is represented in an iconic and highly influential paper by Nisbet and Wilson, which had an enormous influence on the field, even though it was published, continues to have, even though it was published in 1977. The general claim by Nisbet and Wilson is that people have little or no direct introspective access to the reasons and motives for their behavior. Let me refer to an example of this body of work. There's a classic study, even though it was done many years ago, it continues to be cited, classic study by Latney and Darley, referred to by Nisbet and Wilson, who report that the greater the number of bystanders, the less likely people will be helpful or intervene when someone is distressed. The further argument is, and what Latney and Darley purport to show, is that the greater that people are unaware that their behavior is influenced by the number of bystanders. In other words, they don't have access to the reasons for their behavior. Indeed, Latney and Darley reported that when asked, people deny such influence, and which Nisbet and Wilson cite as interpret as buttressing their claim that people are unaware of the reasons for their action. However, as is the case in quite a number of studies in this area, what is not done is a careful analysis of what might be going on beyond the presented account. Let me give you an example of what I'm referring to. Now, the most plausible explanation for the relationship between presence of bystanders and failing to help someone in distress is the rationale or the reason to the effect, well, that if other people are present, I don't need to get involved. This less than admirable reason is one that subjects are not likely to readily acknowledge to someone else or perhaps even to themselves. However, this hardly means that they don't have introspective access to the reasons for their behavior. It's highly likely, and indeed it can be shown, that under certain circumstances, for example, a carefully eliciting interview or talking to a trusted friend, that in those conditions, people would be aware of and acknowledge the reasons for their action. And one should add that in later studies on the bystander phenomenon, there's a demonstration of its complexity. For example, the likelihood of helping someone in distress varies with a variety of factors other than the number of bystanders. For example, it varies with whether the person in distress is a member of an in-group or an out-group. And it also varies, this I find especially interesting, it varies with whether or not a camera is present on the scene. This finding is especially interesting because it suggests that the failure to help is accompanied by some degree of shame or guilt. In other words, if a camera is there, you'll be seen, and therefore, when the camera is present, you'll be less likely to not help. Anyway, in a recent paper entitled "Why Bad Science is Sometimes More Appealing Than Good Science," Oreskes, a historian of science, makes the point that surprising and novel results are cited more frequently than papers that provide modest and incremental knowledge. She also writes that, quote, surprising results are surprising because they go against what experience has led us to believe so far, which, she adds, is a good chance that they're wrong, end of quote. The paper by Nisbet and Wilson and Alotney and Dolly represents an instance of this sort of phenomenon. One reports findings that are surprising, that contradict everyday experience and common sense. And however, what's not apparent to many is the often limited and contrived experimental conditions which render these results possessing relatively little ecological validity, that is, generalizability to real life events. So this perspective that I've described in cognitive psychology on the role of conscious reasons and motives for one's behavior is entirely congruent with the view of consciousness in classical psychoanalytic theory. And that the view of consciousness in classical psychoanalytic theory is described by Paul Ricoeur, a French philosopher, as dissimulating, or as he puts it dramatically, false and replete with lies. According to this view, conscious experience is thought of as manifest content that hides and disguises unconscious latent meanings and motives. So, in the context of both cognitive psychology and psychoanalytic theory, an expert of one kind or another, the scientist in the case of cognitive psychology, and the psychoanalyst, as mentioned, Kenna, in the case of psychoanalysis, an expert is necessary in order to help dispel the illusion that conscious experience constitutes a reliable guide to one's mind or to one's real, in quote, wishes and desires and real motives for one's behavior. Consciousness and subjective experience, to turn now to philosophy, are also given short shrift among influential philosophers of mind. For example, Francis Crick, even though I know he's not a philosopher, his comments, as you'll see, are philosophical in nature. Francis Crick, the Nobel Prize winner, writes, quote, your joys and sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of neural cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll's Alice might have phrased it, you are nothing but, the nothing but is a critical term here, you are nothing but a pack of neurons, end of the quote. And the neuroscientist, also writing philosophically, Nick Chada, maintains that the positing of an inner world of beliefs, desires, motives, and thought is egregiously false, and in fact is nothing but an invention. He writes that no one at any point in human history has ever been guided by inner beliefs and desires any more than any human being has been possessed by evil spirits or watched over by a guardian angel. The stories we tell to justify and explain our own and others' behaviors aren't just wrong in detail. They are thoroughgoing fabrication from start to finish. End of quote. So Chada is not saying that the reasons and motives we have for our behavior we're not aware of or are dissimulating, but there are no such thing as reasons and motives that motivate behavior. It's a much more radical claim. And that claim is more compatible with other versions, other embodiments of the argument in, for example, the eliminative materialism and nothing but reductionism of quite a number of philosophers. For example, the husband and wife team of the Churchlands, Patricia and I forget her husband's name. So how does one account for this? the state of affairs. And it's a particularly important question, it seems to me, because, among other things, there's little doubt that in their ordinary daily lives, like everyone else, Chick and Crater, Crick and Chater, Crick, Chater, and other nothing but theorists function and relate to others as intentional beings and to themselves as intentional beings, much of whose behavior can be understood in terms of subjectively experienced motives, desires, aims, and so on. For example, surely Chater had reasons and motives for writing his book, as well as expectations that his arguments would convince readers. Indeed, if one came across someone who experienced and related to other person's expressions of his or her joys and sorrows as nothing but assemblies of nerve cells, or who experienced himself and others without motives and reasons in relation to feelings and actions, or who, as some philosophers of mind have advised, ceased all talk and presumably all thought of mental states in relating to others, it would be clear that the individual was very likely experiencing a psychotic episode. So this disjunction between how one lives one's life and what one writes about in in one's papers is quite striking. In a paper entitled "The Consciousness Deniers," Galen Strawson refers to the nothing but and eliminative materialism philosophical positions as, quote, the great silliness. I think that's an apt term. It's worth noting that back as early as 1925, the American philosopher C.D. Broad also employed the term silly to characterize the denial of consciousness by philosophical behaviorism. As Strawson points out, the argument that conscious experience is an illusion is a deficient argument insofar as having an illusion is itself an instance of conscious experience. As Strawson puts it, quote, "The trouble with this argument is that any such illusion is already and necessarily an actual instance of the thing said to be an illusion," end of quote. So how then does one account for what Strawson calls this great silliness? I think it's clear that at least one overriding reason for this exclusionary attitude that cuts across different disciplines, psychology, psychoanalysis, and philosophy, lies in the general argument that consciousness is too private, too evanescent, and, so to speak, too non-physical to be accommodated in a physicalistic scientific worldview. As Chalmers puts it, for many years, the prevailing view was that science, which depends on objectivity, could not accommodate something as subjective as consciousness. And I want to add that Jerry Wakefield has shown in a brilliant book on Freud as philosopher that this is essentially also Freud's argument for why mental life is essentially unconscious. Another central reason, which is related to this reason, is the specter of dualism. That is, the fear that recognizing the centrality of consciousness and subjective experience and according them causal power constitute Cartesian dualism. In other words, how could the mind influence a non-physical, presumably non-physical phenomenon influence physical phenomena? Now, okay, so I think what I've described represents a relatively important view among the disciplines I've described. However, it's not the full story. There are notable exceptions to what I've described, And I think this is important because these notable exceptions are indicators of what needs to be done and, so to speak, the way forward. In psychology, these notable exceptions include, go back as early as far as the psychophysics of Fechner and Weber, the research program of the Gestalt psychologist, and the neuroscientifically inclined researchers who routinely, without preoccupation with a mind-body problem and without being haunted by Cartesian dualism, routinely investigate the neural underpinnings of subjective experience. However much they may differ in other respects, what these different approaches have in common is that lived subjective experience constitutes the starting point for their investigation. There's some wonderful quotes from Wolfgang Köhler on this issue. Maybe during the question and answer question period, I could cite them. And as Chalmers points out, there's been a marked shift in attitudes towards the legitimacy of consciousness and subjective experience. Ironically, I think that technical advances in the study of neural processes have invigorated interest in consciousness and subjective experience. Because if you want to know if you want to study the correlates of something, what you're studying is the correlates of consciousness and subjective experience. So you have to recognize not only their existence, but their primacy. I discuss in my book many examples of that. No time for obviously here. In the domain of psychoanalysis, there's been a clear shift from an emphasis on deeply repressed unconscious mental states to at least an equal emphasis on material just below the surface of consciousness. That is, material that is unarticulated, not attended to, not spelled out, or not adequately formulated, but readily accessible to conscious experience. And in the discipline of philosophy, as we've seen, there is a defense of a common sense approach to consciousness and subjective experiences by such philosophers as Gale and Strawson, but also John Searle, and I venture to say by Jerome Wakefield, who I think should be counted among the important philosophers in America. So in coming to the end of this presentation, I want to briefly comment on the explanatory role of experience and consciousness and subjective experience. As functionalists like William James and John Dewey argued, consciousness and the capacity for subjective experience would not have evolved in the course of evolution if they didn't serve important adaptive functions. After all, we could have evolved as robots or zombies, entirely governed by input, computational processes, and output. In this scenario, behavior would be automatically and directly linked to distal functions, or what the biologist Mayer calls ultimate causes, with no mediation by proximal motives of desire, intention, and so on. In the psychoanalytic context, for example, there would be a direct link between instinctual drives and behavior, what Freud describes in quoting George Grodek, we are lived by our id. Consciousness might exist, but it would have no causal powers. But that is not how we're constructed. Distal functions are implemented through proximal motives. That is, distal functions are served by conscious subjective experiences of I want, I desire, I fear, and so on. It's true that conscious motives and desires have the peculiar status, and this, I think, is an important point. Perhaps it accounts for some of the confusion. They have the peculiar status of both serving as an explanatory, as explanation at one level of discourse, and at the same time are phenomena that, as the philosopher Max Black put it, have themselves a, quote, a provenance and an etiology of their own. In other words, that require further explanation themselves. So where do we go from here? I think that and perhaps during the discussion period, there are many studies that would be the findings of which would be extremely difficult to understand or explain without reference to conscious motives and reasons and so on, and without reference to subjective experience of and consciousness. And the fact is that there are, and perhaps, as I said during the discussion, I could present some examples of that, but it seems to me that instead of becoming paralyzed by the mind-body problem, what most researchers do in various fields is they start with the phenomena of lived experience, subjective, and then look for interactions among experience as well as the neural underpinnings of the conscious experience. And that sounds mundane and ordinary, but I think that is really the course that we need to follow. And I think we need to become entirely less preoccupied by philosophical positions, which are a kind of form of ideology that dominate the way in which investigation is supposed to take place. Let me just add one final comment. And I think this is also expressed in Jerry Wakefield's work. We're concerned about the mind, about dualism. We're concerned about the problem of the status of the mind in a physicalistic worldview. However, there's much mystery about the nature of the physical. And I forget which contemporary philosopher made the point. We needn't worry too much about whether consciousness and subjective experience could be accompanied by a physicalist worldview, because we don't have much of a full conception of the physical itself. I think Chomsky made this comment. We needn't worry about such matters because the very concept of what is physical changes with future discoveries. There are mysteries of entanglement and quantum phenomena that we don't begin to fully understand. I read a comment of a Nobel Prize winner last year who discovered entanglement, and his comment was, "I don't have the foggiest idea of how it works." The workaday neuroscientists and psychologists who do their research and provide increasing understanding of how consciousness, the nature of the influences of consciousness, subjective experience, that is the way things will go and should go. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Morris. Jerry?
Yeah, let me start my questions for Professor Eagle. Can I call you Morris, since we know each other?
Yes, of course.
Right? In a way, first of all, your book is an amazing accomplishment, in my view. You're unique in the ability to run away from controversy. There you are. You're unique in your ability, honestly, to cover all these different disciplines, not only psychoanalysis, but mainstream psychology, and so on, philosophy of mind, and on from there. And that's one of the impressive things about your book. What you're doing for us is bringing to our consciousness a pattern across disciplines that makes more manifest for us what's been going on and the problem that we face in not adequately addressing the problem of subjectivity and consciousness in our science. So maybe, as you suggested during your talk, before going to more general issues, maybe the very first thing I can ask you, which you hinted at, was, do you want to share with us a couple of examples where you think in the sciences consciousness has actually been, or subjective experience has adequately been applied in a research study that actually yielded some fruit. Because I think you agree with me that one of the, as you said in your talk, one of the main problems with incorporating subjectivity and consciousness is methodological quandaries about exactly how to do it and how will it link to other variables and so on. So perhaps you could comment on the more constructive side of some exemplars we might have.
Okay, thank you. That's a really a good question, and gives you an opportunity to refer to some studies. One example would be a study that Nisbet and Wilson referred to, make a big deal of. I'll just try to briefly describe it. People are put into the following situation. There are 4 bins of nylon stockings, and they're told that that one bill has a higher quality of sheerness of the nylon, and they're all the same. There are no differences among them. And what they find is that 80% of the subjects choose the last bin as the best quality. And that's an example for them that no one, however, none of those subjects mentioned that they chose on the basis of position. So they take that as an example of, we don't have access to our own reasons and motives for our choices. It's an extraordinary generalization. And that this is evidence for that. However, others carried out the same study, but they engage in what they call an elicitation interview. What were you thinking? And it turns out that the following is the most obvious common sense explanation. You go to the first bin, you can't find any differences. You move on to the second, you can't find any. By the time you come to the last, you still can't find any differences. What are you going to do? Go back and re-examine them? And the experimenter told you that there were differences, so you just pick the last one. It's like as if you were in a store and shopping around and you can't find the best. Well, I'm not going to go back to that again. It's such an obvious common sense account, which is totally overlooked by just forming the results into a preset ideal, so to speak, scientifically ideological frame. So that's one example. The simple step of finding out what these people thought would have led to an entirely different conclusion. Another example, which is actually more interesting, because this one is an example of many of you are familiar with the Michelle marshmallow studies, where kids, you study delay of gratification by saying you can have 1 marshmallow now, or you could wait for a half hour and get 2 marshmallows later. And that's supposedly a measure of capacity for delay of gratification. In one study, the experiment, as the kids walk in, there's random intervention of simply a friendly pat on the shoulder of some of the kids and not of the others, randomly. And it turns out that the kids who have the pat on the shoulder show a significant greater ability to delay gratification. Now imagine that you're a behaviorist in the 30s and you say, well, I don't get involved with with experience. That's not scientific. I'll show a functional relation between pat on the shoulder and ability to delay, a relatively meaningless functional relation. It turns out that there's evidence that a general sense of trust, as well as trust in a specific experimenter, is associated with an ability to delay gratification. And if you think of it in terms of common sense experience, if I trust you, you're more likely to give me the 2 marshmallows at the end of the half hour. And so that's an obvious mundane example, but really it also reveals in a certain sense what Strawson called the great silliness about eliminative materialism and nothing but. There's a great silliness in psychological experiments too. Remember that in the Nisbet and Wilson stocking, it's a contrived situation where the subjects say, trust the experimenter. You told me there were differences. I'm not going to, you haven't lied to me, so I'm going to look for them. I can't find them. I might as well pick the last one. Anyway, the more striking example, and I don't want to take up too much time, is a fascinating. Anyway, maybe we'll get to that example.
Sorry about that.
I hope that answers your question.
Yes, let me just before, again, going to more general issues, let me just follow up this one very specific issue for a moment. So I assume you're not denying, I mean, you're trying to expand our awareness of this lack of study of subjectivity and consciousness and its involvement in our scientific research. You're not really denying that there are unconscious semantic processing and content. So for instance, analogous to the studies you just did, there are the classic studies in cognitive science. Let's take the pot study, where you show people you give people a scenario with the word pot, and it's in a kitchen, and there's some scenario where you're looking for utensil to cook something. Then you do a associational test where it turns out that they also have faster associations to marijuana, another meaning of the word pot. And in those studies, they do interview people afterwards to try to verify that the association was actually unconscious. They say, when you were doing this, did you actually think of the meaning marijuana when we mentioned pot in a kitchen context? And they claim that people say no. Now, there have been a lot of disputes about this, but I'm just wondering, would you be inclined to accept that as unconscious semantic processing? Or would you say, look, that's, as critics have said, that's probably instantaneously in their mind and forgotten immediately, and maybe they say no afterwards? How would you react to that sort of?
That's a really, obviously, an important and probing question. By the way, I'm not suggesting that a few responses. Well, I'm not suggesting that subjective experience and consciousness are present in all behaviors. Obviously, I'm saying when they are clearly present and overlooked, you come up with silly conclusions regarding your findings. So you're quite right to bring that up. What you're describing, of course, is the priming effects of context. And there are many such examples. Marcel did a study with subliminal exposure of the word palm and hand versus tree as the context, and you get the same phenomenon. And it's a tricky thing. You and I have actually discussed this, about the notion of unconscious processing at the semantic level is a really extraordinary phenomenon. Now, the argument that it's momentary consciousness that's forgotten is, of course, William James' argument as
all the way back to James. Yeah,
all the way back to James. It's very tricky. I must say that I have a gut resistance to the acknowledging the possibility of semantic encoding at an unconscious level, but the evidence seems to point to that. So in a way, it's relevant to your book on the representationality of brain states, because obviously some form of representationality, if this is occurring at the unconscious level of brain state, it has to indicate a capacity for representation at the level of a brain process without consciousness. Right. You would agree, I assume.
I agree, and I accept that.
Yeah.
So I accept your thesis that we have under-examined this.
Yes.
But I also accept that it does seem like semantic processing does go on out of consciousness.
Right. And there's still resistance to that idea. I've read arguments that question the reliability of the subliminal
Yes.
and priming effects. So it's a very challenging, very challenging kind of finding. And I would say if one took all those findings seriously, you'd have to say that indeed, yep, there's possibility of semantic processing at the encoding to the semantic level unconsciously.
Okay.
But that doesn't. I hope you see that doesn't refute the points I'm making. And,
not at all.
and
Right.
In fact, if you went too far in that direction, you would come up with the momentary consciousness explanation, because you couldn't accept the idea, and that's of course was James' basis for his reasoning. He couldn't accept the idea if it's unconscious, it's physiological, it's a brain state, it's not mental. Therefore, it has to be momentary consciousness. But that gets too arbitrary and too semantic, two arguments about semantic labels.
Right.
So
let me ask you, jump to another area. Obviously, although you have transcended disciplines, what you are anchored in much of your work in psychoanalysis. I was wondering, so I have several questions about that. First is just a simple question. Kohut is famous for attempting to create a revolution in psychoanalysis. And one of the things that made sense to people, leaving aside the more technical aspects, was his emphasis on what he called experience near interpretation. And even the idea that you interpret just to a little bit ahead of where the patient is, so that they're able to go there because already within their purview to move a little bit. I wondered if you see Kohut as a kind of ally in suggesting this, or do you see other aspects of Kohut as having diverged so much from your position that he would be in another camp entirely?
Yeah, that's an interesting question also. I think it's true that Kohut, if you, let's say, did a content analysis of cohesion, whenever I say cohesion, it makes me think of alien figures from another planet. Watch out for the cohesions. But if one did content analysis of cohesion analysts, probably their experience, their interpretations and accounts would be more experience near in certain respects. However, there are a couple of howevers. However, they might be experienced near in so to speak, in their structure, but I'm not sure they're necessarily capture the patient's actual experience. They're more experienced there in their potential accessibility. To be specific, the interpretations are very likely to include things like lack of feeling of lack of being empathically understood, as well as failure to receive early empathic understanding, accounting for current self-defects and lack of self-cohesiveness. Those are not experienced near concepts. They're inferred structural consequences of such and such. So in that regard, and they're also assumed to exist before you ever see the patient, because that's their conception of the nature of psychopathology. Now, I think that can be contrasted with someone like the work of Paul Gray, who, despite the fact that he's a classical analyst and believes in drive theory, in his actual work, they engage in what's called close process monitoring. They look, and just below the surface of consciousness, they look for things like pauses in free association, in going from attacking someone to suddenly saying, oh, but she's a very good person. And they say, let's stop there for a moment and let's see just what went on. They engage the patient in what is going on. And I think that's a more genuine example of experience near approach. And interesting and ironically, Paul Gray views himself as a Freudian, and Kohut views himself as a self-psychologist. And yet, in the actual work, I think Paul Gray is much closer to being experienced in a real, genuine sense. I don't know if I've made that clear.
Oh, I think so. I wonder what you would say to the following, that so you puzzled, which I puzzle about. I mean, how is it that these philosophers and psychologists claim that there is no consciousness or that it has zero causal impact? And I understand there are philosophical issues there, but the mystery of that, like some of the quotes or some of the positions you mentioned in your talk, in your introductory talk, are puzzling. But now let's leave that aside for a second and go into the psychoanalytic consultation. In the classic situation, the analyst is at some point, after interpreting defenses, making a deep interpretation of the motivating unconscious motivations, desires, fantasies, whatever. And I think you and I probably share the idea that in a lot of cases, this is just a mistake. It's made up, it's ideology, it's psychoanalytic ideology about deep causes, and that it would be better to work as Paul Gray, as you described Paul Gray, from the conscious to the fringe consciousness, as James would put it, and sort of work down. And I guess this is the point, that patients are actually much more aware of the things that are going on defensively in them than psychoanalysts traditionally have given them credit for. Again, it's an imposition of ideology without, as you put it, doing the interview afterwards. Well, were you really aware, even at a slight level, of this? And or was it a surprise that we came up with this? I just wondered how you think about that, how you think about the position of psychoanalysts who do these deep interpretations and seem to not be wanting to think about themselves as actually going beyond what's the truth, but and not working slowly and not doing debriefing afterwards to see if what they're saying is right. Are you following the general tenor? I'm just curious to get your comment on this.
Yeah.
Is this equal puzzle to the behaviorists and the others as to how they can believe what they believe, in my view?
Yeah, well, that's such a complex issue, which I do discuss in the book. I don't know even where to begin to respond to it, but a few thoughts. First of all, to be fair, despite whatever school they belong to, most analysts these days, and I think Paolo would confirm this, would take the position that you go from analysis of defense to uncovering material, that you have to take that first step rather than directly diving in with deep interpretation. So that, I think, has become a clinical wisdom, so to speak. And that, I think, then they don't take the next step, which I think that points the way to the very direction that you were suggesting. The reason they don't take that direction is they view defense as unconscious also. But if you think of defense as just below the surface of consciousness, as Paul Gray does, you're on your road, you're on the way to giving greater credence to accessibility to consciousness without necessarily fancy interventions. That's one comment. The other, let's see, is there is definitely a trend again, to be fair to the psychoanalytic approach, there's definitely a trend in the direction of giving greater and greater emphasis to subjectivity and conscious experience. For example, what comes to mind is a number of things. Winnicott makes a couple of comments. One comment is, I rue the day that I delayed improvement in the patient by giving these deep interpretations. So there's a sense of, are they really mutative? Do they really change people, or do they have the status of what the philosopher Richard Moran called third-person knowledge, which you could be having about another person other than yourself? In other words, do they become really part of who you are? The other comment that Winnicott makes is, which is possibly too dichotomous, the patient doesn't need an interpretation, he needs a new experience. That's practically a quote. And of course, there is the corrective emotional experience concept of Alexander and French, who, it should be noted, when they came up with that concept in 1946, they were viewed as pariahs in the psychoanalytic community. That's no longer the case. Cohen is able to say, if my critics accuse me of focusing on corrective emotional experience, so be it, he says defiantly. So there's clearly been a shift in the field towards an increasing focus on, if not directly in consciousness, accessibility. Really. I just want to add one point, which I discuss in the book, and I'm not going to go into it. I do think that some of the problems are easier to handle when you give up the notion of a dichotomous difference between a dichotomy between conscious and unconscious, with a horizontal bar between them. Here's the unconscious and above, and substitute for it an expanded notion of consciousness as a continuum. You go back to
more of a Jamesian.
You go back to a Jamesian
like fringe and so on. Yes, go on. Sorry.
Right. And when you do that, I think you will find, this is an empirical matter, that what's often called repressed or unconscious is at the fringe of consciousness, is what Fingeret calls not spelled out, not articulated, not attended to, and what Donnell Stern calls not formulated further. So, and by the way, the virtue of that is there's a direct link between cognitive psychology and psychoanalysis. You don't, it reduces the splendid isolation that the field of psychoanalysis has brought upon itself. So those are some, I think, future directions that not openly, but begin to open the door to the increasing importance of the pre-conscious, the accessible, and so on.
Yeah, I would just add myself is that there has been a confusion between unconscious and relentlessly not admitting to something. That is, people have meanings that assault their self-esteem that they are minimally aware of or can be brought into awareness. But there are things I think we all know in our lives and our relationships. There are certain things we just will not admit unless it's very exceptional circumstances. And analysts have to figure out how to get around that feeling of, I can't admit that. That sometimes looks like it's unconscious, but sometimes it's not. That's a different kind of point. I wanted to ask you, but since we're talking about more concrete things, let me move to a very concrete question. So at the end of your book, you have this wonderful poem by...
Oh, yes. Which, by the way, is no longer in the book. It couldn't be included because of copyright issues.
Oh, my God. Okay. So well, I happen to have a copy of it here.
Okay.
Now, I'm not going to read the whole poem because there are other questions waiting to be discussed. But let me read just a passage from it, and then I have a question about this.
Okay, sure.
He's talking about summer is late, my heart, words plucked out of the air some 40 years ago when I was wild with love and torn almost in two, and so on, remembering. And then later in the poem, he says, what makes the engine go? Desire. The longing for the dance stirs in the buried life. One season only, and it is done. So let the battered old willow thrash against the window panes and the house timbers creak. I'm affected by that.
It's
Darling,
lovely.
Remember the man you married? Touch me. Remind me who I am. Now, my point about this is it's very moving, especially as we get on in our years. But my question about this is, it struck me how he is trying to portray the differences, systematic differences in subjective experience between the young person filled with certain desires and, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there action rather than nothing? Desire is the beginning of our universe. And I think he's contrasting that with the nature of life as you get older, and feelings change, desire levels change, perspective changes. I'm just wondering, I don't recall you mentioning it in your book. I hope I'm not forgetting. I could be.
No,
but
I don't.
do you think that there is lurking there a developmental science of experience that could actually be very informative to us in a way that we don't have anything like that out there now, that explains how experience systematically tends to change as you get older? Do you think there's something there that poem indicates?
Gee, that's a fascinating, a really fascinating question. I have to confess, I did not think of it, and it's not in the book. If I understand you correctly, you're saying, okay, well, let's say you're right. We have to focus. There is a primacy of subjective experience and consciousness, but having said that, okay, take it as the focus. Why then should one not, as one does with other things like executive functioning, capacity for verbal representation, why not approach it from a developmental perspective? Systematic changes in how one experiences oneself in the world and how experiences others as a function of time, development, and age. It's a fascinating idea. Now that you mention it, of course I'm aware of it, but all I have to do is, first of all, not just conscious experience. I'm looking at myself in the on Zoom, and all I have to do is look at a photograph of 50 years ago. But we focus on physical change over time, but we don't focus on changes, systematic changes in the structure of experience itself.
Right. And with Erickson's theory of adult development, one could easily...
It doesn't include that.
Yeah. No, it doesn't include that. And yet one can see a parallel that could be very important.
Right. There are implications in Ericksonian stages. For example, generativity. Well, generativity approaches a particular state of mind in which you're preoccupied not so much with this, but with other things and so on. So it's there. It's there implicitly, but not articulated, not developed systematic. So fascinating.
Can I ask you one more question before you go to that?
Of course, yeah.
I just wondered, maybe you haven't thought about this, but I couldn't help but wonder, given your very clear in your book, explanation of how, say, cognitive psychology, which everybody would have thought, oh, that'll lead... Of
course it'll be, yeah.
...study of consciousness, but it didn't in a lot of ways. Then your surprising insight that neuropsychology, which you expected to be the least concerned with consciousness, actually is leading people to make to do studies of correlates more than ever before between brain states and consciousness. I wondered if, and I think this was too late for your book, but I wonder if you've had any thoughts about generative AI, because generative AI, artificial intelligence, has, in my world anyway, created a new storm of interest in when consciousness exists and how can we tell if something's conscious, because obviously there are people running around now saying that their programs are conscious and we should treat them with moral respect and so on, and others saying that's total nonsense. So just as a last general, I just wondered if you had any thoughts about this and which side of the nonsense you come down on.
Right. Well, I have to tell you again, I have such a gut visceral dislike of anything connected with AI, partly because I'm a technological Neanderthal. But it's true, it has generated all this interest, but also it's intensified the interest and the question. It's been there quite a while, like robots alive, or or Dennett's concept of zombies. We're all zombies, that kind of silliness. So I don't I have such I defend against anything having to do with AI.
Okay, I
In
understand.
fact, I've eliminated the letters A and I on my computer.
Well, I
but
have a gut level, resistance to
yeah,
suggest that computers
you know,
actually have consciousness. But you're right. What's happening is, oddly, from this very bizarre
yeah,
source, the issues you're interested in
yes, that's right. That's right.
are being raised again for everyone.
Right. I'm going to provide a kind of Luddite response, but the notion that people debate whether something made of metal and could do many things that people do, or computers, whether they have consciousness, I find that so silly. I have to admit. And I go back to C.D. Broad or Strawson. I think this is an expression of a great silliness,
Right.
whether they're conscious or alive. I think there's a wonderful quote, and it's in my book, but I don't remember. It's to the effect that only very smart philosophers could make such stupid comments.
Right. Philosophy is right.
Yeah, something like that.
At an extremely high level of intelligence. But
right.
The point is, I see it, just to give you a metaphor, just as infants will respond to a few lines because they're programmed to do so, as if it's a face. It has nothing to do with a face. It's just 4 lines or so. I see that as the response to AI. It's a sophisticated case of that. We can't resist sort of feeling like there's somebody there.
Right. That's right. That's right.
How we're designed to be social creatures.
Exactly.
Now, I'm sorry. You had something more you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, but in respect to that, I just read a paper recently of the interface between the robot and the humans, apropos your point, where the intent of the designer is to encourage that reaction. So little eyes are put, or they're made cute and fuzzy. Sure, that elicits certain responses, but it's totally irrelevant to the philosophical question. Yeah, but there was something else. About cognitive psychology that I have in my book. In his brief history of the cognitive revolution, George Miller, computation, doesn't mention Ulrich Neisse, not one word, who was many view as the father of cognitive psychology, his incredibly influential book, Cognitive Psychology. But Neisse, one of his primary concerns was making cognitive psychology have ecological validity, so that it had to do with real world experiences, like the way we remember things, the way we, and so I find it, I know I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I find it interesting that Miller doesn't refer to Neisse at all, given the obvious facts that he was an incredibly important figure in cognitive psychology. What I didn't discuss in this presentation is, I can imagine someone saying, okay, you've described, nothing but reductionism, eliminative materialism in philosophy. What you haven't, and who deny or exclude behaviorism, conscious experience, but you haven't said anything about those people who presumably give primacy to conscious experience and subjectivity, namely the phenomenologists in philosophy and someone like Titchener in psychology. Remember that Titchener's description or label for psychology was the study of conscious experience. Why don't you refer to those as exceptions? So I want to have an opportunity to say why I don't.
So Morris, what about these folks like Titchener? Why don't you talk about them? They're studying.
I know. Now, if you go back to Titchener's textbook of psychoanalysis and to his whole program, it is so removed from ordinary subjective experience and consciousness. And what he does, wanting to mimic the physical sciences, he studies the elements of consciousness through trained introspection, no less. You can't be a subject in Titchener's experiment unless you're trained. What are you trained to do? In a very Husserl-like fashion, you're trained to not commit the stimulus error. You can't say there's an apple. That already implies the existence of objects in the world. You have to say red, round. In other words, that's not studying what Curler would call naive, spontaneous lived experience. So it's not a solution at all. And it's no accident that the product of Titchener's psychology was so sparse that in reaction to it, we had behaviorism. Because the behaviorists say, look what this has produced, virtually nothing. So that's the reason. Now, what about in philosophy? What about Husserl? And Jeff, very briefly, and by the way, Titchener was very much influenced by Husserl.
Interesting.
And you could see the link. The trained introspection of Husserl is paralleled by the bracketing and suspension of the natural attitude by Husserl. So that too doesn't really address the issue of studying experience as it exists in the real world. And finally, Curler, who the phenomenologist wanted to enlist Curler as a phenomenologist, and Curler responds beautifully. If I could find the quote, I'll read it. Basically, he says, "Oh no. You're doing just the opposite of what I do. I start with naive, spontaneous experience, and I study its lawful relations to the external world. And what you do is something entirely different." And there's a brilliant article by Mary Henley, who was, a comment that makes that point. So that's my answer to why not phenomenology. And finally, phenomenologists themselves seem to have realized they hit a dead end, because recently there's been a movement called naturalizing phenomenology. I think it's the name of a book that was published. But what does naturalizing phenomenology mean? It turns out it means studying the correlates of our experience. But that's what neuroscientists do all the time, and that's what psychologists do all the time. So what naturalizing phenomenology turns out to be is, okay, we give up, you win.
If I could add one point, or maybe dispute one point, not quite dispute, but
that's okay. You could dispute
it.
But I'll never talk to you again.
Yes, our relationship will go into the unconscious. I think that Merleau-Ponty and his ilk of, phenomenology, while you could make many of these comments about all the phenomenologists.
I exclude Merleau-Ponty, by the way.
Okay, because I think he does. In a way, there's at least a dimension of Merleau-Ponty, and whether you want to say it's the central or not, he is trying to get at what the Gestaltists called the ground, but it's part like a Jamesian fringe. And
that's right.
So, he says, when you're in Paris, to take a simple example that he used, when you're in Paris, every experience is slightly different because you are experiencing the atmosphere of Paris, even though you're not maybe aware of that in every experience, but it's somewhat different because that's the ground of your figure, whatever it is. And he also has an interpretation along those lines of Freud and the unconscious, that it's not a cognition that's put into some place, but it's rather a kind of lived experience that's the background for your focal experience, and so on. So I think in my reading and in my thinking about it, like I've been working on grief and the prolonged grief disorder and so on recently, I think Merleau-Ponty then, in this phenomenological way, his way of spelling out the background, is spelling out things that are missed by a more focal, approach to the pain of grief, to thinking about how the loved one died and so on. And things like, I mean, just take an example that why does the world seem empty? That's an odd thing. Why does the world seem empty when somebody you love has died? That has nothing to do with losing them. And the answer roughly is your background had united so that your background through which you experienced the world was actually a unification of their way of seeing things and your way of seeing things, so that a dimension of your experience is actually gone and the world feels emptier. Now, whether that's a coherent or correct view, I'm not sure. But I think his brand of phenomenology is exploring what James might have called the fringe or
Right.
our experience. So I think that's one area where we might gain some traction.
I totally agree. I just want to add to that what you already said, that implicit in Merleau-Ponty, and often explicit, is really an extension of consciousness as a continuum in a Jamesian fashion, right? I don't know if you would agree.
Yes.
What you're calling the background could be the fringe of consciousness, but there's a deeper.
Yes.
Pardon me?
Yes.
Right, but there's a deeper issue that you raised that it's central to Merleau-Ponty, and no time to discuss it. It's not just the background or the fringe; it's also the framework. That's the critical, what you call the unifying. It's been the structure of your experience. That person dies, and suddenly the whole, and that's very, very tricky and difficult. I can't even begin to think about it here. Here's a silly example of which I've thought about, but I've almost been too embarrassed to mention it. But it's very Merleau-Pontian. Not too long ago, I got on an escalator, and it was not moving. So I stumbled. Can you imagine the feeling, right? You know, I had to hold on. So clearly, that's an interesting phenomenon. Clearly, at some level, I had an expectation, a background expectation that this visual array moves. And if you asked me, what are my beliefs and expectations, not in 1,000 years would I consciously say, well, among them is I expect metal things that have step-like fashion. When I get on them, they move. No way it would be. And yet, clearly, the only way to account, unless you may not be the only way, but one way of accounting for my stumbling and getting dizzy is it violated my expectation. The world, as I structured it, there was a violation of that, and it was reflected in my bodily experience. Now, you could explain it perhaps in other ways. It was a conditioned response, but even conditioned responses, when they're not reinforced, you don't stumble, they get extinguished over time. So I'm not sure that works as an explanation, but you see why I think of it in Merleau-Pontian terms.
Totally. And that is, at least back in the old days in Berkeley, when we used to talk about these things endlessly. Back in the old days in Berkeley, where we used to talk about this endlessly, it was always that sort of example of how the background comes into the foreground when your expectations are violated, showing that it's lurking there. But surely you don't have, do you have explicit cognitions about every possibility? It's a challenging idea, but yes, the background, very Gestaltish in a way. When the figure doesn't work out the right way, maybe you start looking at the background of the figure.
I just want to add one thing with regard to that. It just occurred to me, this notion of corrective emotional experience can, at least to some degree, be viewed as a positive example of background expectations and assumptions being violated, and therefore shake up the system. Do you see what I mean by that? Yes. I have an implicit expectation that you and everyone else, given my implicit schemas, will react to me in such and such a way. And when you don't, like the escalator doesn't move, when you don't, I have to contend with that. violation of my expectations, and maybe then that opens the system to some form of rearrangement.
This actually is a via phenomenology coming to the Weiss and Sampson kind of control mastery view, that
In a way, absolutely.
You're there as a therapist to violate the pathological expectations of the client and disconfirm the expectations they have. So it's interesting in that way.
Yeah. What they don't do, unfortunately, is they don't recognize that, yes, it may violate my expectations, but what they don't do is recognize that I may be somewhat conflicted about, on the one hand, wanting you to pass the test, on the other hand, finding that threatening and feeling more comfortable, even if I suffer with the expectation being confirmed. Yeah. If it were only a violation of expectation, change would be a lot easier.
They always think that you're not conflicted. You really want to change.
That's right. Exactly.
You know that.
Yes. Yeah. Anyway, so the two different domains, I don't think I'm conflicted about the escalator moving or not moving. but that's quite different than, anyway, okay.
Anyway, I don't know how long you want to go.
No,
because the idea was to go. What did you say, Jerry?
No, I think we could stop here. We've covered quite a bit of territory. What do you think, Morris? I mean, we could.
Yes. No,
there are many other questions that we could discuss philosophically and so on, but I think we've at least gotten a taste of, how your approach and your concern about this omission and anomaly in the sciences and the human sciences, how it has tentacles to all these different areas. And yes, we could discuss more perhaps why has this happened? You tried to address that. Is it that science is like the proverbial drunk person looking for their lost keys under the lamp, because that's where it's easy to find keys, even though the keys got lost elsewhere, so that scientists just look where they can get results and move on in their careers and don't take on the more difficult issues of consciousness. But I think in at least for me, in closing, you have a unique overview in this book of all the different sciences that are relevant, including philosophy as well as psychoanalysis, psychology, and others. And I think it gets us to grapple once again, makes conscious for us, as I said, the fact that we have been looking away from this very challenging issue.
Thank you very much, Jerry. I really appreciate your comments and questions, and thank you, Paolo.
Yeah, but I have to thank you both. What happened that we were supposed to have a webinar for 1 hour, but we did it 1 hour and a half, even more, which is very beautiful. But you did exactly what I was hoping. Basically, you discussed simply for the pleasure to discuss, not to give a webinar. Just as friends, when you meet, you discuss, and you did it now. So this is what I really wanted to do.